Breaking news swept across the world as images and reports emerged of explosions rocking the Moscow skyline. The iconic Moscow City Towers, a gleaming cluster of skyscrapers valued at more than $1 billion, were suddenly transformed into a scene of broken glass, smoke, and panic. For years, these towers stood as symbols of Russia's ambition to be counted among the great financial and cultural centers of the world, an architectural boast that Moscow was not just a political capital but also a global city of wealth and prestige. Yet in a single night, that image was shaken as drones bypassed defenses and slammed into the very heart of Russia's pride. The shock was not only in the damage, but in the reports that followed, whispering that these drones may have come not from Ukraine, but from Poland, a NATO state and one of Kyiv's most vocal allies. The implication was staggering. Could this war, long fought on Ukrainian soil, now be widening into something even more dangerous, with NATO and Russia brushing up against direct confrontation? To understand the full magnitude of what happened in Moscow, one must take a closer look at the war that has unfolded over the past years. When Russian forces rolled across the border in February 2022, few could have predicted how long and grinding the conflict would become. Russia had counted on a quick campaign, believing its superior numbers, heavy armor, and air power would topple Ukraine's defenses in weeks. But Ukraine stood firm, backed by international aid and fueled by the determination of a people fighting for their survival. The war shifted into a bloody stalemate, with trenches reminiscent of the First World War, missile attacks battering cities, and a new weapon rising to prominence: drones. In the early stages, drones were tools of reconnaissance. They hovered quietly above battlefields, mapping enemy positions, guiding artillery strikes, and gathering intelligence. But the creativity and desperation of Ukrainian engineers and soldiers quickly transformed them into weapons. Simple commercial drones were rigged to drop grenades. Homemade designs became kamikaze units, sacrificing themselves to blow up fuel depots or armored vehicles. With Western support, more sophisticated models joined the fight, capable of flying hundreds of kilometers to strike strategic targets. Drones became the great equalizer, allowing a country with far fewer resources than Russia to inflict damage and psychological shock at a fraction of the cost of tanks or missiles. By the summer of 2023, the drone war had expanded beyond the front lines. Suddenly, the Russian homeland was no longer untouchable. Explosions erupted at oil facilities deep inside Russia. Military airfields were hit, damaging valuable aircraft. For the first time, ordinary Russians far from the battlefront began to feel the war pressing into their own lives. And then came the strikes on Moscow itself. Drones buzzing over the capital, sirens wailing, the unthinkable happening before their eyes. The Moscow City Towers, symbols of prosperity and modern ambition, became targets. Though the physical damage was often limited, shattered glass, small fires, disrupted offices, the psychological impact was enormous. These were not obscure factories in distant regions. These were the glittering towers of Moscow, visible from every corner of the city, now scarred by war. The choice of target was deliberate. Wars are not won by military might alone, they are fought in the minds of people. Striking the towers was not about crippling Russia's war machine, but about shaking the confidence of its citizens and elite. It was about sending the message that Moscow was vulnerable, that no amount of wealth or prestige could shield it from the consequences of the war. For Ukrainians, it was a symbolic act of parity. If Russia could rain missiles on Kyiv and Odesa, then Ukraine could bring fear to the Russian capital. For Russians, it was a reminder that the conflict their government insisted was under control had reached their own skyline. But the latest reports add a new and dangerous dimension. If the drones were launched from Poland, the meaning changes completely. Poland is not just any neighbor. Since the beginning of the war, it has stood as one of Ukraine's strongest supporters. It has taken in millions of refugees, sent weapons and ammunition, and become the main transit route for Western military aid. Polish leaders have spoken bluntly, calling Russia an existential threat to Europe. For Moscow, Poland represents not only a foe but a forward base of NATO influence right on its doorstep. If a drone strike on Moscow can be traced back to Polish soil, whether officially sanctioned or not, the Kremlin faces a perilous choice: ignore it and appear weak, or retaliate and risk triggering NATO's collective defense pact. The idea of Article 5, NATO's core principle, hangs over every calculation. It states that an attack on one member is an attack on all, binding the United States, Britain, Germany, and every other ally to come to that country's defense. Even the possibility of testing that principle terrifies strategists. If Russia struck Poland in response, it could ignite a chain of escalation that no one could control, plunging Europe into a wider war. Yet from Moscow's perspective, to allow such a strike to pass unanswered undermines the very authority of the state. Vladimir Putin has built his rule on projecting strength, on convincing Russians and the world that their nation is powerful and unshakable. To be struck in the heart of Moscow without retaliation would erode that carefully crafted image. As this drama plays out, the role of drones themselves becomes clearer. They are not just tools of war, but symbols of a new era in conflict. In the 20th century, power was measured by fleets of tanks, aircraft carriers, and nuclear warheads. In the 21st, it is increasingly measured by adaptability, technology, and the ability to use cheap, flexible tools in innovative ways. A drone costing a few $1,000s can slip through billion-dollar defense systems. It can bypass radars, confuse missile batteries, and strike symbolic targets with devastating psychological impact. For Ukraine, drones have become a lifeline, a way to fight an adversary that dwarfs it in traditional firepower. For Russia, they are a nightmare, exposing vulnerabilities and undermining confidence. The Moscow city strike demonstrates all of these dynamics. Militarily, the damage is modest. No tower collapsed, no high-ranking officials were killed. But performance cannot be measured only in rubble. Performance here is psychological. The drones performed brilliantly in that sense, achieving maximum impact with minimal resources. They broke through defenses that were supposed to be impenetrable, embarrassed a government obsessed with control, and dominated international headlines. In a war where perception drives politics, that is performance at the highest level. The supposed safety features of Moscow, its radar systems, anti-aircraft defenses, and electronic warfare technologies, were meant to shield the capital. Billions were spent to create layers of protection. Yet the drones exposed the fragility of those defenses. Small, nimble, and cheap, they evaded the very systems designed to stop them. For ordinary Russians, the message is unsettling. If their leaders cannot keep Moscow safe, what can they protect? For international observers, it is a reminder that even the mightiest militaries are vulnerable to innovation and persistence. What makes this strike stand out from the many others in the conflict are its unique qualities. The target was not a hidden military depot but a highly visible landmark, a glittering skyscraper complex known to millions. The suspected origin from Poland transforms the meaning from a Ukrainian act of resistance to a potential NATO-linked provocation. And the timing, coming after months of grinding warfare with no decisive outcome, injects new uncertainty into the conflict. Each of these factors elevates the event from a routine strike into a watershed moment. The cost of this attack cannot be measured in dollars alone. Repairs to the towers will run into millions, but the true price is psychological, political, and strategic. Russia must now spend even more to defend its capital, diverting resources from the battlefield. Its citizens pay the price in fear and anxiety. Poland, if implicated, risks retaliation or at least intensifying hostility. Ukraine, while gaining a symbolic victory, must also brace for harsher counterattacks. And the world at large faces the possibility that the price of this strike could one day be a wider European war. Yet despite the risks, the strike highlights a truth that cannot be ignored. Wars are no longer confined to trenches and front lines. They spill into cities, economies, and symbols. They test not just armies but societies. The Moscow City Towers strike may be remembered not for the physical destruction it caused, but for the way it revealed the vulnerabilities of a superpower, the courage of a smaller nation, and the fragility of peace in Europe. For Ukraine, the message is clear: they can reach the Russian capital, they can touch the symbols of power. For Russia, the reality is undeniable. No amount of propaganda can erase the images of smoke rising from their skyscrapers. For NATO, the stakes grow ever higher. The line between supporting Ukraine and becoming part of the war grows thinner with every escalation. And for the world, the question looms: is this the beginning of a new phase, one that could spiral beyond control? The Moscow strike is not the end of the war, but it is a turning point. It shows how innovation, symbolism, and psychology are shaping this conflict as much as tanks and missiles. It demonstrates that the cost of war is not just in lives lost and buildings destroyed, but in the fear it plants, the pride it shatters, and the risks it multiplies. And it leaves us all wondering what comes next, and whether this war, once thought to be confined to Ukraine, may one day engulf us all.